Okay, we're just waiting until 7 o'clock until we do kick off so that any other attendees can join. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this discussion around unblocking the talent pipeline and looking very carefully in the discussion with some excellent panel guests who are joining us today. So, what I'd like to do is frame this discussion with we all know that there are barriers to where we see talent being uh, able to get into trust leadership. And the purpose of this discussion is also to look at what solutions are in place. And so the provocation around this, that I'd like to start with each panelist. So just a brief one or two sentences from each panelist as we go to introduce this theme before we get into deeper discussion. So Christalla, may I start with you?
Absolutely. So, good evening. I think one of the main blockers is recognizing the structural and systemic series of complications that make it very difficult for certain. I think there's a perception that whiteness is a way into trust leadership, and there's also a perception of males being the ideal superhumans for these positions. I think they're the two main blockers, and I'm here to speak on behalf of Women Ed and share some intel into not only my journey, but where I think we can become better at opening that door for other leaders as trust leaders sitting here this evening. So that's the angle that I'd like to come at and perhaps share some harsh statistics along the way this evening. So I think the two main blockers are, whiteness is a route in, and being a man is another celebration. And we've just got to change that narrative and call it out.
Thank you, Christalla. And I think it is really important to frame this around some systemic issues. And as you say, all of the data and metrics point towards exactly the issues that you've just discussed. Amjad, can I have your view, please?
Yes, hello everyone. I don't know why I keep zooming in and out. That isn't an intentional thing to kind of bring emphasis on me. I've got a new computer, so it seems to be doing wherever it likes. I'm glad that Christella is going to be bringing stats and facts and raising the issues. I think so that we don't repeat ourselves, what I'd talk about is the notion of once you're in trust leadership, like myself, how to avoid not elevating other people because you're thinking,
Mm.
well, you can't do that because then it will look like you're just helping your own or trying to get other people in like yourself. So kind of looking at that idea of once the ladder's been passed down to you, not pulling up the ladder for other people and actually allowing for the recognition of others to go through without thinking you got there because you worked really hard or you overcome those barriers and you overcome those obstacles and actually enabling others to do that. I think that will help complement what Costello's going to talk about.
Thank you, Amjad. So again, and you and I have had a discussion before about becoming that ladder, because I think sometimes when we talk about representation, we can get lost a little bit in the sense of actually making sure that we are still being in an equitable and equal space, and perhaps a tension between equality and equity. However, going back to Kristalla's point, I doubt there are very many white men who consider the implications of elevating a white man into a position of leadership as being something that will be seen as a negative on their own position. And I think that's a really interesting framing. Leora, may I come to you, please?
Thank you, Dan. So I think I want to talk about three things: governance,
Mhm.
the pipeline, and professional development. Um, so I don't know how much you want me to say about those three things now, Dan, or did you just want me to say what I'm going to say later on in the conversation?
No, I think a praise to you that would be helpful at this point, Leora, if you don't mind.
So, governance seems particularly important to me because, of course, in the trust sector, the trust board is the employer. And while there is, chronic underrepresentation within trust leadership, within executive leadership, there is also a major issue for us on boards.
Mhm.
Um, this is not just an issue within the trust sector, so we've also seen it in other sectors where perhaps more work has been done. But one of the things I think we know is that boards recruit in their own image.
Yes.
So if we haven't diversified governance, we are unlikely to be able to properly diversify leadership in the trust sector. So that feels very important to me. And I can talk about a specific piece of work outside of education in the corporate sector that was done very successfully, called Women on Boards. So women is the only diversity that we're talking about here, but that was a specific project that got very good outcomes. So secondly, the pipeline. Jack Worth from the NFER has done very important, significant work, I think, on equality, diversity, inclusion in the workforce. And we know right from the point of initial teacher education, there appears to be some blockers to stop a more diverse group of people even entering the teaching profession. So we've got a problem even at the point of entry. And then as people progress in their careers, that problem becomes more and more acute. So if we're going to solve this problem, we have to address, I think, the whole pipeline, including recruitment into initial teacher education. And then I think there's also something about professional development. So one of the things interested my colleagues from BAMEd and WomenEd might know this better than me, but I think certainly, I know this is true for women, doubt their ability to progress. And so if you look at a person specification and you think, oh, I probably only meet 3/4 of this, I'm not ready to apply yet. And yet your male counterpart will look at it and say, I meet half of this, I'm good to go. So I think there's something about talent spotting and supporting our colleagues to have the confidence to apply for positions. But in part, that confidence comes from knowledge through professional development, and very, very kind of secure knowledge. So I think there's something about professional development. And then even within professional development programs, I think a commitment to EDI in those programs is probably really quite important. So those are the 3 things that I wanted to focus on.
Thank you, Leora. And again, I think it's a really interesting point because, especially around the EDI and social justice space in this, I don't think we've yet got to a point where the culture and system has seen access and excellence as being interconnected, and therefore that actually representation and an understanding at board level from governance, as you say, has a really significant impact on that overall zeitgeist and psyche that are those with different characteristics from traditional leadership positions would have. Amy, can I come to you now, please? Thank you, Leora.
Yeah, thank you. Evening, everybody. I think a lot of the areas that Leora has begun to touch on are areas that I'd like us to explore tonight. I think for me, there were 2 things. One is around a real intentional visibility about what those roles look like, what the knowledge, the skills, the experience are, and that's not a closed shop that you either know or you don't know, and you know because you're in or because you're not in. That actually this should be around ensuring that the programs we put together, the way we recruit, the way that we train and develop people, means that that's not a lottery. It isn't about the fact that you happen to know, or you happen to have been shown, or you happen to have learned. That actually there's a real intentionality around that, and that we build those principles of equity and belonging into that design of the way that we recruit, we retain, we develop people, to try to remove that potential situation of it being a lottery of opportunity, and it needs to be much more intentional about that. So I think there's something really key about visibility here, but I also think there is then an aspect which is to do with, that I found Leora's point around sort of person specifications and the way particularly that women will view those person specifications. So I think also linking to what Amjad said, there is something really important about people who are in these roles being able to talk about what that looks like, what those vulnerabilities are, and that this is not about presenting images of completeness and sort of having everything sort of completely nailed down, that there is a vulnerability in us to be able to talk about that and share that and show that actually this is something that is open and accessible. So those are the kind of two interconnected areas for me.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So I think in framing this overall discussion, what we've heard so far is effectively that unblocking the equity pipeline comes down to removing those systemic barriers that have to date prevented individuals from underrepresented groups and with diverse characteristics from progressing through the educational professional system into leadership. And that a number of these issues, such as unconscious bias or systemic discrimination, are as much around cultural capability building as they are as around structural change. Because the interconnectedness you speak to there, Amy, I think speaks to the heart of that, as well as Leora's point around the board. And I think what's really important when we look at that is understanding, therefore, that the problem has to be seen through underrepresentation. That's really the problem we're addressing here. And really looking at the systemic barriers that sit underneath it. When we do get to some of the really quite worrying statistics, I think the other point that we have to frame this is with those intersectional experiences. So just as Christalla, you were talking about, from when you have leaders who are representing more than one of those underrepresented aspects, what that looks like from an intersectional point of view, and how that creates those unique obstacles, actually, both in terms of underrepresentation and the systemic barriers to success. So whilst we just go a bit more deeply into the understanding the problem and framing the problem before we get to those strategies to unblocking it, I suppose if you would open your mics, and I'd invite a conversation at this point amongst yourselves, particularly on the underrepresentation point first, because I think that underrepresentation, whether as Leora was talking about in the board level, and what that means actually, therefore, for the overall aspect of seeing not much change in this space over a number of years. Amjad, you kindly will no doubt have some of the statistics to back, but Christalla, can I come to you to give us a grounding in the data and metrics, and as well as your lived experience, please?
So if I can selfishly start with a reminder of our Women Ed 4, our main 4 campaign. So it's to increase the representation of women in leadership. It's to increase the diversity of women in leadership. It's to reduce the gender pay gap, and we're advocates for flexible working. So the statistics, I'm going to show you the development from head teacher to CEO. So in primary schools in 2020, so I'm going back 5 years, female teachers are about 85% of the primary workforce, and yet 74 of those made up head teachers. In secondary schools, female teachers made up 63% of the workforce, and yet 40% of those were head teachers. And if I move from that to the bigger challenge, so what we're talking about tonight, and CEOs, when we're advancing the gender equity, we want to create conditions in our schools. What we're talking about, the perspective I'm bringing is to enable women to thrive and to attain success through the pipeline, but ultimately in those top jobs in schools and in multi-academy trusts. And to achieve this, I completely agree with what Leora was saying about CPD, that professional development, starting the EDI program, at the top, at that board level, and building, I suppose I'll use the term impactful professional development that builds that life learning, lifelong rewarding careers, and to retain more people to work in our schools where they're really needed. You need to be visible. We need to see who we want to be. Now, Anne Palmer, the CEO of, I think it's called the Fig Tree.
Yeah.
She shared some really interesting insights. And before I share that, I'm just going to quote the percentage of CEOs. So in the big trust, the percentage of CEOs that were women in 2018 was 26.4%. And that increased in 2020 to 26.6%. Now, if I give you a reminder of head teachers as women in that same year, it was 74% were women in primary, 40% were women in secondary, and in 2020, female CEOs was 27.6%. And we started to grow a little. So our disruption was effective, let's say. By 2021, That was 33.3%. And then in 2023, we had a bit of a dip to 32.2%. Then an audit was done, just looking at the system change across the breadth into the senior executive leadership and also reflecting diversity of the student body. And the audit found that 45 out of the 143 CEOs, and that included the biggest trust this year, the year just gone, sorry, academic year, was 31.7%. Now that again is down from the 33% of the audit 2 years ago. So we kind of make a bit of a jump and then we go back again. But even more worrying than that is out of the four global majority CEOs, so there's four in our country, just one is a woman, and I think it's Janice Alozi, if I've pronounced her name correctly. She's from the University of Chichester Academy Trust. I just think these are horrific statistics that I'm not just shouting out about gender, I'm also shouting out about diversity of ethnicity. And I just wanted to bring that really to the forefront because that's the biggest problem. I think that the biggest barrier is not only is our gender the wrong gender, the colour of our skin, the roots of our ethnicity also seems to be the wrong one. So what can we do? So on a personal note, following on from what all the speakers have said, I grabbed an opportunity, and I don't know if it's by default or by accident. I took on an interim role because an interim role was put out there for 2 days a week. So I had gone from exec head through interview to be an interim CEO. I don't know if you remember in April 22 when the white paper was around and primaries had to group. There was a possibility that, you know, secondaries were better, or whichever perspective you're looking at it. So you had to group with a secondary trust. So there was a lot of insecurity. So my position wasn't permanent and it was interim. I think predominantly 2 days a week, we had a couple of troubled schools that needed a bit of extra TLC. So my role really was school improvement. I've got to be honest, for a couple of years, it was school improvement. Having now not only stabilised, but we're in a really strong position academically through external moderation. So for me, we're a trust, a C of E trust. All our 10 schools are at least good. We have outstanding schools using the old-fashioned Ofsted terminology, and they're all through with SIAMs, so the Section 48. Now, having actually succeeded, so they're stuck with me now, I'm learning the breadth really of my role, that it's not just about school improvement, and I'm starting to develop that, something I've never hidden, and it's something that I'm actually welcoming as I grow in my success as a leader of our trust. I think the challenges lie for others that I don't always like, echoing what Leora said about that. I hate the term imposter syndrome because we're not ill, we don't have a syndrome, but the lack of self-confidence. And that's why I think I have kind of an ABC strategy. So the first one would be access, you know, making sure it goes beyond ITT, beyond ECT. What is that pathway for staff at all levels? And that can be non-teaching staff as well. It could be within the trust, so we're growing our own and beyond. The B is the breadth. So what is it when Amy said, you know, clarity, visibility, well, what is it we're offering then? What is that professional pathway that everyone can grasp onto, regardless of whether you're site staff, office staff, kitchen staff, teaching staff, or other? And then my C is that absolute clarity that links to the visibility, links to everything there, but actually giving those stepping stones so everyone can achieve that. I won't go into great detail, otherwise it's only my voice that's heard here. But following on from the whole EDI, I felt that in my first year, I just needed to train and educate and bring to the forefront what I felt what the blockers were. And actually our board's transformed. I think there's one, maybe two. I think there's only one original board member. That not that it's a bad thing, but as we've grown and developed, we've added that diversity by being quite courageous and and shouting it out. We're actually saying, but we don't have women, we don't have people of colour, we don't have. So looking at the protected characteristics. The next tier was local governance. So we've gone to the local academy committee. And this year, so it's part of a 5-year programme. This year, it's bespoke to head teachers so that it goes whole school. I couldn't have done that in a year.
No.
So I think there needs strategy so that this isn't a quick fix. This is just, we are the architects, aren't we, of the future? So what are we? So selfishly, I'm devising a strategy with others. Don't do anything on my own, but I'm very good at employing people that complement my skills. And there's a strategy there that's sustainable so that we don't go back into, was it the term, I wrote it down, that Leora said about the boards recruiting people in their own image, and
Yeah.
trying to avoid that with an element of this is what my internal moral compass is telling me to do, but also an element of this is what the world needs, this is what our children need. I'm going to end there.
No, I think that's really interesting. And I think one of the things to really glean from that, and I'm going to bring you in, Leora, I think on that board perspective in particular, it's what you've spoken about, but I think sometimes gets missed in that approach, positive approach to this, is the intentionality, that it needs to be more than, it needs to be a strategically planned, it needs to be resourced, it needs to be timed, and it needs to be co-constructed. Because the other thing we've got to be careful of, I think, sometimes is making it seem that those who may have been in the original board were somehow not, didn't have a right to be there, whilst also forefronting the fact that change from an intentional point of view to be representative and indeed to be far more diverse in that approach is in fact a positive. And Leora, can we ask for your specialism on the governance side to come in to support and challenge Christalla's view there about strategically intentional DEI at a board level?
Sure. So before I do that, can I say, which I should have said in my opening remarks, I think there's a kind of pressure at both ends. So when I was talking about governance at the top as the employer, that's pressure at the top around getting recruitment right. And then, of course, the point I made about pipeline and the barriers at entry level at initial teacher education, that's the barrier at the bottom. So we have to solve both pressures at the top and at the bottom, because we're kind of literally squeezing people out otherwise. On governance in particular, I think what I'd like to start by is paying attention to the culture of boards. So board culture sets the tone for an organisation. Culture starts at the top. And I think it's really important to diversify boards, but I think there's quite a lot of literature saying we can set sort of targets for the number of women or the number of people from ethnically diverse backgrounds we want on our boards. But if the culture isn't right, then we bring those people in and they don't feel like they belong. They just like they sort of the token representatives. And I think in that early work that I talked about with women on boards, there was some of that happening. Yeah. Women were recruited onto boards, but then didn't feel like they belonged in those boardrooms, couldn't find a voice. So I think but my word of caution to boards developing a kind of an EDI strategy to diversify their boards would be, don't just make this a target setting exercise. Okay. Pay a lot of attention to the culture of your boardroom to make sure that people feel like they have a right to be, that they're right to have a seat at that table, and a right to contribute. I am very persuaded by Matthew Said's work. So he talks a lot about, he does a lot of analysis around seeing excellence and equity as sort of slightly different things. And yeah. the great thing about Matthew Said is he says that they're the same. So what happens when you get a group of people around a board table or around any table, around an executive table, where they all think in the same way, is that although they are individually great people potentially, they are, as a group and as a corporate entity, they have real blindness, so they can't they can't make good decisions because of that blindness. You see, his work in this area is very compelling. So this is not about excellence or equity, and it's not tokenism. Getting a diverse board is not just a target setting exercise where we bring people onto the board. It is actually about strengthening governance. And
Absolutely right. And if I may, Leora, sorry, I was particularly struck by the Next Gen Conference on Governance held by CST, where a number of representatives were also talking about the age dynamics that we often find on boards, and the fact, and actually, a quote that stayed with me from one of the speakers was, "Having a seat at the table isn't the same as having a place," and I thought that was a really interesting way of, as you're saying, talking about cultural norms and an expectation somehow that representation or inviting someone along for the meal means that's going to be
enough
by itself, and it isn't. And the second point that I thought was really fascinating was around that concept of thinkversity, which actually, if you do have people from similar backgrounds with similar characteristics in terms of all of those protected characteristics, you have similar mindsets, and therefore we end up in a somewhat echo chamber, which doesn't therefore prompt the kind of innovation and indeed that real commitment to the Nolan principles and ethical leadership that we want to see. Apologies for coming across, but it was exactly what I thought was such a strong point on the next gen.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for saying that. That's very kind of you. And while I'm sitting here in this fantastic webinar, I'm thinking that you invited the wrong person. Really, you should have Samira Siddiqui, who is our Director of Trust Governance, who's absolutely brilliant and knowledgeable and speaks with much more authority than I do in this area. So it feels to me like next gen governance is all the things you say, Dan. It is about creating the board culture that welcomes diversity, that understands that groupthink is actually really dangerous, and that the way we achieve excellence in governance is actually through diversifying our boards. And that is a first step then to creating an employer function that can also lead to a more diverse workforce.
I think that's really important. And may I just ask, when we're talking, the other interesting thing that I think came out from Next Gen, especially from female BAME participants who were in their 20s, were saying that sometimes when we talk about positive aspects, for example, outreach programs and mentorship, is an important aspect. But equally, I thought the other good challenge was, but that shouldn't be expected to come from the same communities every time. That actually the work shouldn't have to be done by those who are in need of the work. And it was a really interesting point again to challenge, I think, those attendees and participants around whose responsibility is this?
Yeah, that's right. So any of us have the ability to spot talent and to tap people on the shoulder and to nurture and to use Amjad's language to put the ladder down. Any of us have that ability, but also we have that as a responsibility. So I definitely don't think we should be putting the onus on underrepresented groups to be solving the problems of representation. I think we share that as a responsibility.
I think that's spot on. Amjad, can I bring you in at this point, please?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I think it's important for us to think about what your tangible strategy is to make these things happen. Having joined the Chiltern Learning Trust in January this year and watching them kind of from an outsider's perspective and joining the trust kind of central team structure, it's been fascinating that diversity and equity being achieved has not been by accident. It's been through intention, and the people strategy that's been put in place by the trust and the directness of kind of where are the gaps and what are we going to do about the gaps is really important. Just to echo what Leora said, that's been absolutely driven by governance and governance within the school structures and pushing and probing the trust itself in further expanding and saying, is this still enough? Are we still doing enough in this area? So it's that uniqueness of knowing where your gaps are and then being intentional about how to move forward with your gaps, but also not just saying, well, 10 of our schools have an ethnic minority head teacher, whatever. That's not it. It's not about hitting stats. It's about, does your community feel represented? Are you represented? And what are you doing to continue to represent at all levels, not just ethnically, racially, religiously, sexuality, and all of the protected characteristics? It's important for us to understand that. And I guess one of the things that is relevant and important in trust leadership as well is that me having my second role of delivering CPD as I work part-time for Chiltern Learning Trust, I've been to endless conferences and delivered lots of keynotes, and I've been very fortunate. And it'd be rarely will I deliver to a room where there will be more than 5 members of an ethnic minority group. Rarely will I deliver at a conference where there will be me and someone else that looks like me delivering, unless it's Sufyan, of course, who lots of you know. But that's interesting in itself, isn't it? That most people will know Sufyan and maybe know me, and that can't be the case where you know 2 of the only speakers around at these kind of events, etc. We shouldn't be able to list and name everyone, especially from an ethnic minority group. So the idea is, if you've got a gap, there's no point just saying we've got a gap. That's the first stage. Yep, no problem. But then what are we going to do about the gap? What's your strategy for the gap? And Chiltern Learning Trust have a people strategy, and that whole element is encapsulated within that people strategy. That people strategy is then wound all the way throughout the system and all the way throughout the processes. So the head teachers, the governance, the trustees, and it has to be a collective, unified approach to enable those barriers to be overcome, but not just sitting and saying, well, actually, that's okay for us here because we've already got above national average or above whatsoever. So it's been fascinating for me seeing that journey. I must admit, having only joined a trust role in January, I wouldn't have thought it was possible for somebody to get within that kind of structure, especially someone like me. But not only that, just to bring in another kind of element of equity here, flexibility. So I work flexible for the trust, and it's very rare to get a flexible job. And whilst it's even rarer for women to get it, I understand in terms of asking to have a significant leadership position at a 0.6 or 0.4 or 0.8, people kind of balk. They're like, oh no, I can't. How will you be able to do that? And having worked at a part-time level in leadership for the last 10 years and worked for myself alongside that, it's still fascinating how rare it is to find someone that does that. And the question that was posed, that my CEO said to me, Adrian, was, I'd rather have some of you than none of you. And so that idea of kind of how are we getting talent that is also seeking to develop themselves and continue to develop within our systems and be more flexible. We talk about flexibility a lot with children, adaptations a lot with children, but I don't think we think outside of the box enough to draw in talent. And what it can't boil down to is just a really super creative person. You can't just have this like magic person that does everything. And yes, they need to drive it and push things forward and maybe initiate it and maybe trigger the change, but there has to be a strategy. And I think that's really important. And that strategy has to be encapsulated by all of the stakeholders, to echo what Christalla and Leora have said.
Thank you, Anja. And I think, again, you're spot on, because that's where it loops into Leora's point. We do need to think differently about this in order that we are doing things differently. And that's when we get to the space of being different. And Amy, I think that links actually with your introductory point. So if you'd like to come in at that point to both, again, respond to Amjad's point and more generally bring your viewpoint in.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really interested in all the comments that have been made, but particularly this concept of culture and the real intentionality of exploring that culture, stating that culture, and modelling that culture. And it was great to hear Christalla's sort of lived experience in that as well. I was appointed as an assistant head, sort of my first kind of major senior leadership role in a boys' school. So this would be 2009. And the school had existed since 1883. And I was the first woman to hold a leadership role in that school. And with the most fantastic male head teacher. And I wasn't appointed because I was a woman, but what I suppose my reflection from that around that intentionality of culture is then, like Leora spoke about the boardroom culture, there is then helping, in my case as a woman, to flourish in a situation in a leadership team that was male. And that wasn't the fault of the men around that table, but it was male in a male environment where there hadn't been a female leader. So actually, whilst the head teacher was the most incredible head teacher and modelled for me and sort of mentored me as a leader, that intentionality of giving me a voice through a coach actually, and through other women leaders that I could work with, to explore the things that we perhaps didn't know were going to be difficult until they were difficult. We couldn't necessarily have planned for those things, but actually recognizing that this was a different space that I was entering into in a different culture, and therefore giving me a person who I could talk to, I could work with. I therefore, you know, all the speakers tonight have talked about that importance of a voice. This isn't a token gesture. And actually, therefore, as a woman, developing a voice which meant that I understood what my place was around that table, how I did that, but also the bits that I just found really difficult that weren't the fault of anybody else. And when I think about that now, you know, a number of people have talked about how we intentionally tap people on the shoulder. I absolutely agree with that, but I think it's not enough just to intentionally tap people on the shoulder. We've then got to say, well, okay, what is the culture of the organisation that we are recruiting anybody into, actually, from ITT right the way through? And where do we need to recognise that we need coaching, we need mentoring, we need open and honest conversations, so that at that point, as a new female leader, it was sometimes hard to find my voice in a room of men who were used to operating in a male-dominated environment. And as I say, that is not a criticism of any of those men, but therefore showing that visibility of other successful female leaders for me, but the space to say, I'm finding that bit hard. It's not just getting the role, it's not just the intentional tapping of somebody on the shoulder, it's also the support that you then put in place to recognise what the challenges might be, and really intentionally support through those challenges too. And I think we can do that systematically. And we absolutely need to do it systematically, but we also need to do it person by person. And those individual conversations, mentoring, support networks are hugely important. And as Christalla said, you know, I'm speaking on behalf of women, and I can only speak as a woman, but those principles, I think, are something we should be exploring around culture. We've got to be bold to have difficult conversations, and bold to say, actually, that bit's really difficult for me, or I'm finding that hard, or the culture, in whatever sense it is making this difficult to get into the role, to succeed in the role, to flourish in the role, and to empower those conversations to happen that are not about blame, they're not about the fault of, but actually, if nobody makes those statements, and if nobody is allowed the space for that vulnerability, then actually we won't change those cultures, and we won't change those, you know, Leora spoke about whether it's a boardroom table, an exec table, a senior leadership table, a middle leadership table, it doesn't really matter. The culture is the culture, but we've got to be really intentional about articulating that, I think. And I'm sure we'll kind of pick up a conversation about structural professional development, but I just wanted to lean into that sort of intentionality with support and with mentoring and with coaching that sits with that.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, we've talked about that current leadership pipeline suffering effectively from structural inequities, and that is what prevents diverse talent from progressing. But it comes back to that seat at the table. You know, I have many privileges. I'm male. I'm not white British, but I'm assumed to be. So I get a lot of privilege from what people assume my ethnicity is, even though it isn't. But I remember, you know, 25 years ago when I first entered senior leadership, being from a very working class background, being not heterosexual, means although you have a number of privileges, I felt it was a club that I wasn't part of, and I felt that the prevailing ethos of white male straight leaders was very different from mine. And I think in a way, when I look back, I probably subsumed some of my own characteristics and didn't talk about things like my ethnic background or my sexuality for fear that it marked me out. Now, others don't have that privilege because they're not able to, if you like, hide characteristics in the same way. But it's interesting to me because I do think that I've glimpsed it because I was sometimes assumed to be part of a club that I'm absolutely not part of. And actually that caused some dissonance itself because it's always reassured me that that work around diversity, equity, and inclusion is about making sure if I found barriers myself, even though privileges I have, then those who aren't able to do it, I mean, and it was a different time, but it's very striking, and this is why I want to get into structural reform now. It's not as different as it should be. And I think going back to Christalla's statistics, we have seen some improvement, but the rate is glacial compared to it being genuinely representative. The pipelines coming through have not improved. And I think your point, Amy, around that coaching, because sometimes I think we rely on formal and informal networks very heavily in this space, but they're not necessarily networks that have true power or authority in that traditional or patriarchal system that we still exist within. And so that can be problematic in itself. So let's turn to those structural changes and let's turn to the positives. We have 20 minutes now. We know what the problem is, and we have some case studies and some excellent examples from panelists that have really bucked that trend and shown it. And I'm really interested in those personal stories. What can we do in that systemic sense? And we've talked about some aspects around governance, and we understand it's intentional and strategic. But what does it look like on the ground? If we have any people who are at the start of their career and they're joining a pipeline, what optimism and indeed promise are we making to them that this will be a different landscape as we go forward? And what is our collective space in that as both a sector and as professionals who are committed to it? Leora.
Thank you. So just to share a conversation that I was very proud to be part of today, and also to come back to Amjad's description of the work of the Chiltern Learning Trust. I'm familiar with that work, Amjad, and it's deeply impressive, that strategy that Chiltern Learning Trust has. So I was at a 2-hour meeting today with the Vice Chancellor of De Montfort University with a group of trust leaders from Leicester and Leicestershire. And it blew me away in so many ways, actually. But for the purposes of tonight, one of the things that interested me was they talked about a piece of work that they're doing with the CSD member trust, the Mead Educational Trust, based in Leicester, on one of the first teaching apprenticeships. And the CEO of Mead Education Trust, Sarah, said, if you have attended a Mead school, if you taught in a Mead school, if you've served in any way in a Mead school, you're part of the Mead family, and therefore we're going to invest in you. And so they actively, as I know Chiltern Learning Trust does as well, they recruit from their own community. Mm-hmm. Now, I think this is, they didn't use these words, but I think this is an example of a civic workforce strategy.
Absolutely.
And I think, in the NHS, this language is more embedded, this idea that we can see our communities as assets and that we can intentionally recruit from our own communities, and we can invest in those communities, in workforces, so that our children do recognise the adults in the school in a much more powerful way than perhaps they do at the moment. So it feels to me like we've got some green shoots, both in terms of solving our teacher recruitment and retention crisis, because this is a new route into teaching, but also to solve the problem of diversity in the teaching support staff, leadership, CEO workforce, by thinking differently about how and where we recruit from, and by investing right at the point of entry. So Sarah talked about this they do recruit their TAs from their community. But those teaching assistants are pretty much known to them. So it's people who've come back into this very trusted culture in order to develop their careers. And I think if we could be more intentional about those civic workforce strategies in the way that Children Learning Trust or the Mead Trust has, I think that is part of the solution. And the great thing is we don't need anybody's permission to do it.
Absolutely right. And I think those are some great examples. But I do think, again, there has been a much stronger move sector-wide to understand this is something that we should be absolutely planning in our people strategies, in our governance approaches, and to move away from a deficit model actually around our communities and around our workforce. And I think that pipeline aspect, because the truth of the matter is, and I think we should acknowledge, we do need to be doing this work at a board level in recruiting CEOs, in looking, but the true work will come through by focusing actually at entry points and by diversification of the greatest aspects of our workforce as we're recruiting in. So that actually this is a discussion in 20 years' time that I hope would have an extremely different tenet than what we're having today. Christalla, would you like to come back into on that, please?
Yeah, so while Leora was talking, I was Googling something just to find what so while I Google, I have like my notes opened and drag them across always. And actually it's something that was echoed, I think it was called the ASCL roadmap. I think it was last week.
Yeah.
And it was just something there that I've just dragged across. So I hope it's the right quote now. And it said, it was talking about everything we've discussed, sort of our policies in our trust, of that structure, defining what it means, growing our own, if that's a more familiar term. And then it says, however, recruitment alone isn't sufficient. Schools and colleges should provide structured leadership mentoring programs to provide clear progression routes for educators. And it goes on about inclusivity in training and policies, creating those equitable environments. And it says that strengthening workforce diversity requires a multi-layered approach. And I think as a trust, we're not there yet. I'm trying to put in, we are trying to put in the foundation so that multi-layered approach, we're nowhere near the development of Chiltern or Mead, but we're starting with almost like an audit level. Let's see, I think, was it Amjad that said, what are the gaps? Identifying those gaps is probably the easiest part of the journey, and then devising a strategy to not only narrow the gap, but allow that, the retention, the progression, and that fostering of that culture will now develop. It won't be something that we see is what other trusts do. So actually, I'm just going to phone Amjad at the end. I'm just going to say, show me your people's strategy, and I'm going to latify it. I'm going to make it at the LDBS Academies Trust. That's not going to work. I think the process is so important. So while you were all talking, I've written a process that I think I now need to reflect on, because it's very in the moment, knee jerk to what you've opened my thoughts to. I think that baseline will then, feed into policy and structure. I think that the next level has to be culture and narrative. The language you use is so important, isn't it? It can be offensive, or it can welcome. And I'm looking at some policies. I'm looking at Ofsted. I'm looking at documentation. I'm worried about, the term that we've grown to love, where we talk about flourishing and belonging. How do we nurture that, not to just disappear into the ether because, I don't know, because SEN are this group that's really important at the moment. But what does that actually mean on the ground in my school? Are my most vulnerable? So I think we do that with leaders as well, and with this pipeline. I think then capacity building. Yeah, let's be selfish. Let's provide that route. Let's show our children that we're growing our own, and that's what we want for them. But I think there needs to be a tier in there somewhere about accountability and impact, so that, we finally end with this future vision. How lovely would it be if we had our own trust across the whole of the UK, and this is what we did our way? I think we're very privileged tonight, aren't we? We share so many commonalities. There isn't something that I thought, oh no, who is this person? Why are you talking? What are you the root of all our intentions here is we just want to make it better for the children. When we're trying to provide a better future for the communities we serve, so that in generations to come, what we're perceiving as the norm, I hate that word now, actually these are the stages, and I think that's the missing bit, that
Yeah.
those stages will define the individuality and the trust. The same way we look at consistency in curriculum, the same way we devise all that to do that heavy lifting as a trust. That's the joy of being in our trust. We've agreed we're going to teach this. How you do it is that's where you add the authenticity. And my understanding of that as a head teacher was very different. I felt that that's coercive. Why am I going to teach? Why am I going to teach that? Because the other 10 schools are. So I've grown in my understanding of that at teaching level, because that's the bit I find easy. I'm now developing that at a central team level, so that equity, that culture that all of us are echoing is there, but not to disappear if I was not to be there.
Understood. And
Does
to have
that make
those
sense?
firm roots. No, it absolutely does. I think one word I'm going to challenge, if I'm honest, is when you said about making those is selfish. It's not selfish, it's intentionally equitable. And again, in terms of language, I think we've got to be really unapologetic about being intentional about broadening that pipeline and opening up opportunities. And that's where I think Amjad's point is exactly right. This is not about climbing the ladder and whipping it up. This is about
No.
being the ladder. It is about being absolutely intentional to allow those who are underrepresented historically and currently to be able to climb into leadership. Because surely the whole purpose of this work is about breaking down those barriers to build up leaders,
Yeah.
regardless of characteristic, and sometimes very because of. And that intentionality is not something that any of us should apologize for. Amjad, can I bring you in at that point, please?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been struck by is I know over the years that I've been invited to various conferences or events to speak because they need to tick a box, they need a brown speaker. And the reason why I haven't refused that invitation, despite knowing that they're trying to tick a box, is because I then use that platform to show that I'm good enough to be there anyway. And therefore, by accident, you managed to do really well anyhow, right? Now, I think one of the things that's important in doing that is I don't think there's a single ethnic minority or a protected characteristic group representative that would want a position just because of their protected characteristic.
No.
They just want the opportunity to achieve that position despite their protected characteristic.
Absolutely right.
And
Yeah.
so, what's important for us and for leaders that are in this position already is to be very human centered. And
Hmm.
again, a piece of work that we're doing across the trust at the moment is based around human centered leadership. So now that you're in a leadership position, it's our ethical, moral, and statutory, I guess, duty to be really human centered to enable others to feel that they can get there despite whatever gaps or deficits, I use in a very loose term, they might have or might come across as. And something that I think we do not do enough on or enough with is this element of relational leadership and how you cannot be a relational leader unless you connect with everybody and you connect with anybody. And so it's important for us to understand that. And interestingly, just to add to what you said, Leora, in terms of hiring from the community. So my trust is Luton based and Bedfordshire based. I don't live there. I grew up in Reading, and instantly one of the big assumptions that a lot of people had when I started was, "Oh, where in Luton are you from?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm not." And one of the other assumptions from external people, not within the trust, was, "So who do you know in the trust?" Well, actually nobody. Like I've met a few people here and there, and they've seen me speak, but nobody. So you get this other misconception or this other kind of invalidation to your position of you must either know someone or you must be connected to someone in some way.
Yeah.
And therefore, that then creates another kind of form of pushing you towards the back and that kind of sidelining. But with this idea of hiring through your community, actually maybe it's not a negative to assume that you're from that area, and that's a positive as well. So it's a kind of learning moment for me. But I think just to summarize this, that idea of knowing who your community is, but then also acknowledging that you will work just as hard or just as strongly or put in just as much effort as anybody else. But we also have recognized, and people that have been in the EDI space before it become DEI or IDI or DEB, DEEI, will have been saying all of this idea of we've had to work twice as hard to get to half the position. And
Yeah.
so it's important for us to recognize that. And therefore, one of the things that the Baymed Network do is we provide free coaching and mentoring for people that want to get up there. We provide guidance on how to apply, how to write applications, how to interview, and all those things are on our website. And these aren't plugs because we're selling anything, because as you know, everything's free and we don't make any money or anything like that from there. But where there's a gap, grassroots movements have had to step in. So Women Ed, BayMed, all of those groups have had to step in. And so it's important to then not reinvent the wheel as well. So a lot of trusts and organizations will be going, right, we need to do this and we need to do that. But people are doing it. So actually
Absolutely.
talk to them and talk to the grassroots organizations and now the charities like Women Ed and BayMed and Head Teachers Roundtable that are doing things that will actually say, here you go, we can guide. Whilst it's not just to stick your logo on it, but as a starting point, it's interesting to know where do I kind of go from.
I think that's really interesting. You're spot on again, because this is about a partnership space now. And I think it really is important that we reach out and we seek expertise, but we seek experience. And we also find ways to collectivize this approach. Amy, over to you for a very brief summary, if I may, before I close.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of things. I think, Dan, you made the point about language, and I think it's absolutely key. In My Trust, the Mercian Trust, we are just at the beginning of an extended piece of work to achieve our sort of vivid vision for our trust, which is about creating an equitable entitlement for professional learning. And I think using that language and really thinking through the principles of what does it mean to have an equitable entitlement. And for us, that is about mapping what are the knowledge, the skills, the experience that you need to have in particular roles. And it's then not just saying, well, that's what I need. It's then saying, well, actually, as a group of schools, how can we equitably, intentionally give the entitlement to our colleagues to access that knowledge, skills, and experience that they need? It's not because you happen to be in the right place. It's not because you happen to have somebody who you work for who's brilliant. This should be and will be an equitable entitlement. And I think that language is absolutely key in that. You know, I think we've talked about CEO roles and trust leadership roles. I feel really passionately that if you are an ITT trainee, why should you not see and understand the professional learning that a CEO is undertaking? If you want to see that, why shouldn't you? If you want to understand the knowledge and the skills and experience that a CEO needs to have, why should that be closed off until you've gone through a number of steps? So our approach is to make that open and transparent so that there is an equitable entitlement. And sometimes that phrase, you can't see it and you can't be it unless you can see it. I absolutely echo that. But I think that is also around knowing what those knowledge, skills, and experience need to be. In a summary for you, Dan, I think.
No, I appreciate your spot on again. We've got to demystify some of this, because I think to pull together these discussions, what's really clear, equity in multi-academy trust leadership is not just about being the moral imperative, which is absolutely real, but it is strategically essential. And that's where we have to work together to remove those systemic barriers by reaching out to existing networks, but also making sure that for all talent to flourish, to use the word Christalla, that absolutely I think is a key aspect of the work we're doing in the system. We don't just diversify our leadership tables, but we actually strengthen the entire educational system. And that's the root of this, is that the solutions exist. And we know bias-free recruitment, structured mentorship, a real transparent progression route, that equitable entitlement, Amy, that you've spoken so well about, and data-driven accountability. None of these are revolutionary concepts. They are practical tools that are waiting to be implemented with real intentionality. And therefore, what's needed, I think, is a much stronger collective will to see these barriers as something that is just almost unforgivable. And Leo, I think your point, we don't need permission, is exactly right. It's exactly right. And so I hope what everyone listening to this and part of knows is every trust and every single one of us that commits to inclusive leadership development we become the catalyst for sector-wide transformation. We become the ladder that you spoke so eloquently about, Amjad, because every barrier removed will create a space for the next generation of diverse, authentic educational leaders to emerge and to take their rightful place at the table and to feel that that place is theirs. And so that every mentor relationship forged today will shape an inclusive leader and a culture for tomorrow. So in my eyes, actually, and as a result of this conversation and where I take real optimism, I don't think the pipeline is broken. I think it's been artificially narrowed. And I think, therefore, by widening it deliberately, by widening it systemically, we collectively have that responsibility to unlock the full spectrum of leadership and educational potential that we see in the communities we teach and serve. And therefore, the future of educational leadership is inclusive, it's equitable, and it's already within our grasp. And I suppose the question we have to pose ourselves as we close off now is, what is stopping us from being the change and being that ladder? Because without that change, this is a conversation which will repeat. And in doing so, we let down another generation who should be able to access with equity and with dignity and with justice the opportunities that should be there for all. Because if that isn't the purpose of education, then really, what are we doing here? Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for your provoking and brilliant insights. Appreciated as always. And for those listening, I hope this has been a helpful space and a workshop that's made you really think and hopefully recommitted your own sense of being that ladder for other people. Have a lovely evening, everyone.